All right, welcome everybody to Seeking Forgiveness for a Paycheck Protection Program Loan. My name is Jean Bell. I'm with Nonprofit Quarterly and I curate a number of our management and leadership webinars. We're so glad that you've joined us. I imagine that many of you have been on previous PPP loan webinars with Gina and me, so welcome back to those of you who have. And maybe some of you didn't do that and now you got a loan and you're realizing it's time to start thinking about how we ensure that we're complying with the forgiveness mandates of that. Welcome, Gina McDonald. Gina has been wonderful through this whole PPP process, and of course, FMA as a national firm focused on nonprofits and philanthropy has been tracking PPP really with sort of a journalistic eye, haven't you? Triaging daily or weekly to make sure that your website is up to date. So what a project it's been for you as finance capacity builders to track on this. And we're grateful that you've also been willing to partner with NPQ periodically and keep our audience up to date and keep us up to date. I want to note that we have a sponsor for today's webinar that allows us to bring this to you for free. You see that in the upper right-hand corner, and iDonate is a digital giving solution for nonprofits. Okay, they have all of the bells and whistles. I'm going to read a few of them. The software instantly equips your organization with web and mobile giving, peer-to-peer fundraising, text to give, and so much more. So if you're looking for that, it also, of course, integrates with your CRM easily. Go to idonate.com/GoModern because it's a modern solution. And thank you to them for sponsoring today's session. You also see a hashtag there, NPQ COVID. If you're going to share your ideas about this webinar on social media, please use that hashtag NPQ COVID. Next slide, please. The other thing I want to share with you is, as has been true with all of Gina's PPP webinars, we have over 1,000 people attending today and many other thousands who have registered and will listen to the recording. So please do use the Q&A box. That said, we obviously are not going to be able to answer each question individually. My job is to be scanning that Q&A box as Gina talks, and at the intervals that she's chosen in breaks in the content, I will pose thematic questions to her. Another great thing is that not only are you going to get the recording and the slides, which are really reference material for you, as Gina just was explaining to me. There's a lot of content in these slides that is meant for you to be able to go back to when you're actually doing your forgiveness preparation and reference. You're going to get the recording, you're going to get the slides, and then Gina's also going to, after we have this conversation, recommend a set of resources from FMA, links, FAQs that seem especially relevant to what came up in today's session. Those links will be included in the follow-up email. So a lot that you're going to get to support you in this process. So use the Q&A box, but know that we may not get to your specific question, but I'm looking for themes and we'll do the best we can, but you're going to get a follow-up email with resources as well. Okay, Gina, welcome. And in addition to just being an incredible expert and CPA on nonprofit finance, you've become, whether you wanted to or not, a PPP expert. And as I said, a really welcome guest here at NPQ. So I'm going to turn it over to you to walk us through how you frame today's content, and I'll be posing questions when you invite them.
Sounds great. Hi, everybody. And thanks, Jean, and thanks to NPQ, of course, FMA, and myself. We're happy to be here today. It really does seem like we were just together delivering some PPP content geared towards managing your PPP loan, just yesterday, but the reality is that that was actually back in May. So it's been a couple of months since we've been together. And of course, as you mentioned, folks can find that webinar recording on NPQ's YouTube channel. I'll also share where we can find some enhancements to today's materials, as you mentioned. But what are we going to talk about today? So knowing that we were together last time talking about managing your loan, really got into last time digging into what can we use the loan for, things of that nature. So we're going to presume we have that background already. And today we're going to move forward with talking about, now that I have the loan, now that I either have spent all of my loan proceeds or I'm in the middle of spending my loan proceeds, I'm thinking to the future about applying for forgiveness. So we're going to talk about what should we expect from that process? What does it look like in terms of how do I collect data, fill out the form, and then what happens in terms of process related for me to apply to my lender and then wait to hear back. So we're going to talk about process. We're going to talk about completing the form. What should we gather? We're going to look at a couple of versions of the form, both the standard application and the EZ, which folks might have heard about. But we're going to spend most of our time here in number 3. What do we need to collect, calculate, and complete for each section of this application? So really, we're going to focus here on the 3 C's. But as we mentioned, some of us may still have questions about what we covered before. Maybe when we get into collecting information, or maybe when we do a calculation, it leads us back to a prior question about eligibility of expenses, things of that nature. So also want to remind folks, Jean, as you mentioned, you can look at the FMA website, navigate to the PPP Toolbox Clinic if you have specific questions about eligibility of expenses, because we're really not covering that today. If you have really nitty-gritty details about the timing of those expenses, the concept of expenses both paid and incurred being eligible for PPP. Again, that's not in today's content, but acknowledging it's an important concept. You also can find that information here in the toolbox. And we're going to get into a little bit of an update today because we didn't cover it back in May. It's a new concept. This idea of a covered period, or the period in which you can spend PPP, as either now being an 8-week or a 24-week period. You can also get, we're going to touch upon it, but you can get more details of that as well on the website. Related to today's content, what you'll find on our website is also a forgiveness application simulator and estimator that's in Excel. So you can actually practice your calculations there. There's also some more in-depth guidance on estimating your full-time equivalent count. We're going to get maybe more of our fill of talking about FTEs in this next hour, but there's also that guidance. There's also an Excel-based FTE estimator as well. If we have lots of employees, potentially lots of part-timers, maybe with variable hours, we might want to use that Excel tool to help us do some of the calculations we're going to talk about today. And then, Jean, as you mentioned, that FAQ document that we update is also on our website. So we have a lot of content today, and also wanted to mention before we jump into what should we expect from the forgiveness application and that related process, that a lot of the slides we're going to see are really full of information. So lots of text, might initially, a lot of numbers and math as well, might initially look overwhelming. You know, Jean reminded me, hey, all of us are in the throes of trying to navigate PPP. So, you know, kind of bring it on, because this is the information we need. But we really hope that when you receive these slides, they really serve as a reference document for you, which is why they're so packed in this way. But have no fear, we're going to talk through the concepts together here today and break it all down. So you are forewarned of all the details and math you will see. So what does the process look like from start to finish as it relates to forgiveness? We're going to talk today again about what documents do I need to gather. So we're going to be in the mode first of gathering a lot of information, completing the application, and know that the application we complete is really going to be maybe related to the form and content of the application, maybe related to the lender we're working with. So just like when we went through the process to apply for our PPP loan, different lenders had different kinds of applications for that. Some of them are on paper, some were online. Some said, you know, email me the form. So again, we may see variation in how we're going to complete the forgiveness application, and we'll work with our lender through that. We will, however, have up to 10 months from the end of our covered period to submit this forgiveness application to our lender. So we also have lots of time to work through this. We don't need to do it right in this moment. Once we submit the application to our lender, they may have questions. right? So now our lender is going to be reviewing those documents. They're going to verify this information. The lender has 60 days from when we submit the application to them to send that application to the SBA for review and processing. So we can see how our timeline here potentially is a long one. The SBA then, once they receive the forgiveness application from our lender, then has 90 days to review and to notify the lender of the result. So no one has been through this whole process yet. We don't know what will come about as folks are moving through it. We have heard of some lenders starting to accept applications. You'll have to check with your bank as to when that application becomes available and open. But we've heard of a couple of banks here and there who have started to accept the applications. Also, it is true that the SBA has told us that we could apply anywhere between an 8-week covered period and say a 24-week covered period, meaning if I'm choosing a 24-week covered period, or that's my period where I'm spending PPP loans, maybe week 16, I'm all done spending. I exhausted my funds. I don't need to wait 10 months to send in my application. I also don't even need to wait for those 24 weeks to be up. I could actually do my forgiveness application right away. We don't know how that's going to work in practice, because there are some calculations we're going to see really depend upon and utilize your covered period in some of the calculations, but we know that it's possible, right? We know it's possible. We also know some folks want to get this over with and hurry up and apply for forgiveness and move on. So again, this is an open question. How will this work if we're applying for forgiveness before our covered period is over, if we're using that 24-week period? Well, what does the application look like anyway? So this is something that, again, in May when we met, we were awaiting some updated applications or model forms from the SBA to help us understand what does the forgiveness process entail. So we now know that we have 2 model applications that the SBA has provided to us. We have a standard application for forgiveness and a Form EZ for forgiveness. We're saying take a breath. You've probably filled out more cumbersome grant applications or maybe your own tax return. So we'll be able to do this too. You also can definitely go online. These forms are available, plus the instructions for all of us to see. So we also can check out what these look like in real life. But know that these are model applications from the SBA. Remember, your lender may do something like have an online portal that asks you for the information necessary for these forms, but your lender may not give you this identical form and say, fill out these 3 pages. It might look a little bit different or be organized different, maybe in an online portal, if you will. But we do not anticipate that any of the components would be different. These will be, what we're going to talk about today will hold true no matter what the actual form looks like from your lender. So knowing that there's seemingly a couple of options here, and one called the EZ, would have us think, well, there's a quick and easy way to apply for forgiveness. We're wondering though, and we're going to walk you through, if I am eligible to use the EZ form, is it really easier or not? And so one of my FMA colleagues, Chitra, said the EZ form may be a present you may not be able to open. It's like a present you can't open because although it's available, we have to meet certain requirements to be eligible to use the EZ form. In order to figure out if you're eligible, you likely have to go through calculations, and the calculations look like the calculations that are in the standard form. So it's a little bit of a circular kind of equation here, but let's see what is the difference between the EZ form and the standard form in terms of information necessary. So the SBA says you're eligible to use the EASY form if you did not make some significant wage reductions, right? And so again, we're going to see in a moment when we walk through some potential reductions in forgiveness, what kind of wage reduction are they talking about? If I actually had some deep pay cuts, meaning folks who made $100,000 or less in 2019, if those folks had pay cuts of more than 25%, I would not be eligible to use the EASY. So again, some of us might have to do some math if folks took pay cuts to figure out if it was more than 25% or not, right? So we're starting to do some of the calculations. These are the calcs that are necessary for the standard form. So I have to be able to say that, nope, we did not have folks take pay cuts that were not restored. We also have to be able to attest to either either B or C here, meaning if we did not have fluctuations in our workforce that was not restored. If I have reductions in workforce, then I cannot use the EASY form. So what we're saying is we have to be able to attest folks did not take deep pay cuts that were not restored, and we did not have a reduction in workforce or a fluctuation in our staff that was not restored by 12/31/20. So I've got to be able to say those two things, or I have to be able to say we didn't make deep pay cuts that were not restored, and we had reductions in workforce, but we're covered by this safe harbor here that's indicated by letter C. So this big question of the safe harbor is, if we had a reduction in workforce, but we can attest to the fact that we experienced a reduction in business activity as compared to what our activity looked like in February as a direct result of complying with health directives, then I can kind of take this blanket safe harbor and also be eligible for the EASY. And I guess, Jean, I see you're jumping in.
Yeah, Gina, I just want to quickly underscore that maybe 25% of the questions so far, as you predicted, have to do with this parenthetical in B, right? Which is, what if we couldn't rehire? What if they wanted to leave? What if they were fired for cause, et cetera, et cetera. So, a lot of people seem to be asking about that, just as they did, early on in terms of eligibility. Now they're asking about it in terms of forgiveness. And is there anything else you just kind of want to advise sort of globally about that section there?
Absolutely. We're going to spend most of our time on that.
Okay.
So we will get to that for sure.
Perfect.
Yep. So really the long and the short of it is, these analyses we need to make are the same analyses regardless as to whether we think we're eligible for an EASY or a more standard form, right? And we're going to get into very much both how I figure out if I made deep pay cuts and what those look like, and what is happening in this box B here, right? How do I measure my FTE count? What are the exceptions that are available to me? So that's where we're going to spend most of our time. This is what a completed page 1 of the standard form looks like. Don't worry about trying to read all the line items or the numbers right now. This is what we're going to review. So you'll have to complete information like this in some way. You'll also have to provide a lot of supporting documentation, supporting schedules, and sign off on a list of certifications that we'll talk about as well. But really, we can break down these components into 3 parts. So the first part here is, tell the SBA how you spent your PPP loan. So that's what it's in this first section here. The second section talks about those penalties we just referred to. Penalties for making deep pay cuts, potential penalties for reduction in FTE count, right? So green section up top is, how did we spend the loan? Do we have any penalties in our second section? And then finally, we get to do some simple math here, some simple comparison, and determine what is my potential maximum forgiveness. So these are the 3 components we're going to review. Before we actually start to fill out any version of the forgiveness application, however, we do have to make a couple of choices. We have to decide, first and foremost, how are we going to define our covered period? Right, so regardless as to which way we go, what the online portal looks like or paper form, we need to know, are we talking about an 8-week covered period or a 24-week covered period? So remember, the primary purpose of your PPP loan is to use it on allowable expenses in that time frame. So this is why it's important that we decide which time frame, because this is how we're going to accumulate and report expenses. The SBA is really particular. I know initially there were lots of questions as to if I'm choosing 8 weeks, when does my 8 weeks begin, right? And is it a really strict 8-week period? What if I got my loan on a Friday? Can I start my period on Monday? Questions like that. So this is actually really clear. Covered period starts with the day you received your loan disbursement, right? So no question as to when you start counting the days, and it's an exact number of days. 8 weeks is exactly 56 days from that starting point. 24 weeks, it's exactly 168 days. We won't get into it in great detail right now, but when you look later at the more fuller slide deck, there is an option for an alternative payroll covered period. But when you look at our materials, you will notice it's not actually advantageous to choose the alternative payroll covered period. And we have on our website a slide deck that walks through lots of examples of different payroll cycles and demonstrates with numbers, the advantage of just sticking with the standard either 8-week or 24-week period. So we just wanted to mention that. But this will be the first choice we'd have to make is, am I going with 8 weeks or 24 weeks?
Okay, I just want to make sure, I don't want to anticipate this, cut you off, just answering so many questions. Can I go to 24 if I started with 8?
Yep, so
okay.
You don't have to do anything special. You could be all done. You could have been done at week 7, spent everything. And now we're just kind of waiting because we were waiting for the application process to be available and so forth. 3 months from now, you could decide you want to go for forgiveness. And you could say, I want to choose 8 or 24. And maybe although I was done spending at 7, I'm a nonprofit and maybe I want to do what nonprofits do and arrange the puzzle piece of my funding in a different way.
Exactly.
So although initially I thought I was going to count all of this payroll for all of these weeks for PPP, I think it would be better if I maybe build a government funder for that because my grant ended soon after and actually allocated my PPP to dollars later because now I have this longer window.
Okay, that answers another whole set of questions.
You could totally do that. Yep.
Thank you.
Yep, absolutely. So besides determining what the covered period is, right, either 8 or 24 weeks, and here, of course, it describes, that it begins, of course, the date of the loan disbursement as we discussed. We also have to figure out when it comes to FTE count, are we going to use a mathematical method or a simplified method, which we'll talk about. We'll see what both methods look like. And we'll also have to choose a comparison period. So once we figure out what our FTE count is in our covered period, we've got to compare that to something for us to figure out if FTEs were reduced as compared to what time period. So we have a couple of choices as to that comparison time period, and we'll get into that. So really we have these 3 choices to make. Okay. Jean, this is where we thought we were going to take a quick-ish question break, but if it seems like we've been kind of filtering them in, we could keep going.
Yeah, I think we can keep going. Those were 2 huge groups that we talked about, and you're going to get into more about the wage reduction scenarios. So as you predicted, that's a huge piece of it. And then you answered you can be flexible to the 24-week period. So I think we're good to move on at this point.
Great. So now we're going to get into the nitty-gritty here. What do we need to collect, calculate, and complete for each section of the application? So here are our 3 sections again in our standard application. We already reviewed the first section here is tell me how you spent the money in the green section. Then we're going to see if we are impacted by any penalties. And then we'll be able to calculate our maximum forgiveness amount. So what should we begin to gather to start putting together the information we need? And here's where we've got a screen with lots of text. So we can start to think about this like a checklist. And don't worry about reading all of these words right now. Again, we can take a breath and read this later on. But really what we want to think about is we're going to need to gather a lot of payroll information, right? So we need payroll reports for all of the different time periods for which we need to calculate FTEs, right? So we already know we're going to have to calculate FTEs for our covered period. We know we're going to have to calculate FTEs for that comparison period. We're going to see some other moments in time where we might have to gather payroll information for some different time periods as well. In particular, if we had pay cuts and things of that nature, we will have to be comparing payroll for different time periods. So we're going to get payroll reports overlapping with our covered period, listed by each employee. So these need to be detailed payroll reports that list everybody, lists their cash compensation, and we need to be able to see in these payroll reports any state or local payroll taxes that were paid by the organization. And so detailed payroll reports. We're going to need other backup documentation. We need reports or statements showing any other benefits that we paid for folks. So we need to see what we paid for health insurance, things of that nature. When it comes to that FTE count, if the payroll reports that we are gathering also do not list hours worked and things of that nature, we need to try and see, can we get reports that show, listed by employees, total number of hours worked per week or per pay period? Again, as of, for our covered period, for our comparison period, as of January 1st, as of the beginning of the year, and if folks took pay cuts, if we reduced staff and then later we restored those reductions, we need to gather the information to show that restoration, right? So if folks took pay cuts, but then we were able to restore, or if we had a reduction in FTE and then we rehired later on because we have through December 31st to do so, we need to have evidence of all of that. So this is why most of what we're gathering really is related to payroll. Now, of course, many of us or most of us have outsourced payroll service providers. Lots of payroll service providers are putting together custom reports that include just what we need for PPP. So please check with your payroll service provider to see if they have developed a PPP compliant report. Right? That would be the easiest thing, and that would be great. Right? We'd say, okay, give me the PPP report for this time period. And it would be something that would really make it a lot easier to gather and calculate this. Of course, we'll also have to have backup for other kinds of expenses that we are considering eligible for PPP. So if we're going to claim things like rent or utility payments, things of that nature, gather that supporting documentation as well. The invoices, copies of checks, things of that nature. So really, we're starting on a data gathering mission here. We're taking another deep breath because we may still have to gather a little bit more, maybe not. So again, we've already mentioned, if folks took pay cuts, right, we want to gather information that shows that restoration. So these are some questions here, just to find out, do I have to keep gathering or am I all done, right? Did we reduce salaries or hourly rates? How about the fact that folks who make over $100,000 are treated differently in some of these calculations for PPP? So in those payroll reports I gathered, is it clear who has an annualized salary of $100,000 or more or not? If not, I might have to do some other gathering to evidence what folks make as an annual salary. So just really think about what happened in your organization in these time periods, and that will help us figure out how much we have to gather, what is the supporting documentation. Okay? So after we go on our fact-finding mission, we finally have the information we need to complete the first section of the forgiveness application. We're going to go a little bit quickly through this section because it's mainly review, and I know we want to get to talking about those penalties and those FTE calculations. So really we're talking about all the gathering I did will really help me accumulate so I can report total payroll costs and total other kinds of expenses that were eligible for PPP. I can evidence to the SBA how this money was utilized. So as a reminder, payroll for PPP purposes, remember, consists of cash compensation for folks, right? So really gross wages that are going to end up on your employee's W-2 for the covered period, right, that we're claiming to PPP. Remember here it indicates the compensation is capped per person. We've got to pay attention to the caps for folks who make an annualized salary over $100,000. That's where the caps come in. So we can't charge PPP more than $15,385 per employee if we're using the 8-week covered period. Can't charge PPP more than $46,154 for an individual, a person, if we're using a 24-week covered period. We're also going to count as payroll any company paid health, dental, vision benefits, just the employer paid portion. Any employer paid retirement benefits, so you know, the 401k match, 403b match, things of that nature. And any employer paid state and local payroll taxes. So from all that information we gathered, we'll be able to accumulate these numbers for our covered period. That's going to be what we report in that top section. Remember, we can't claim FICA. No federal taxes, can't claim FICA, Social Security, Medicare for PPP. That's something that's a little bit different. And of course, we're going to do a similar accumulation of any non-payroll costs that are eligible for PPP. So reminder of that short list of expenses that were eligible for PPP besides payroll. And those are limited to mortgage interest, not principal, business mortgage interest, business rent or lease payments, and business utility payments. Again, we've got a lot of detail elsewhere and a lot of nitty-gritty questions as to what is included in these items.
Right.
So I see you have a question.
Just to be clear, since we've talked about these slides as reference, can you go back one slide, Gina? Is that problematic?
Nope.
So for instance, in your last line 4, those are examples of things that are included, or is that everything? So for instance, like sanitation or...
This is everything.
Okay, it's everything. So you really do need to look and see what exactly is allowable, because there are going to be some things that you may think of as business maintenance that are not covered by PPP.
So that's a great question. So this is the list. When SBA talks about business utility payments, it's limited to electricity, gas, water, transportation, telephone, and internet. So that is the list that they've given us.
Okay.
And reminder that all of these kinds of non-payroll expenses are related to services that were turned on and in place and obligations that existed on 2/15/20. Because this is about business continuity, not business expansion, right? So if I started renting a new place and I started doing that in May, I cannot claim that rent for PPP. It's, you know, when the pandemic hit, what was in place, and they're giving us dollars to try and continue that.
Great. So hoping there were a number of questions about expenses that are not on this list. Hope that that's clear. They are not covered. Even though you might think of them as business continuity, there are aspects of those business continuity non-payroll expenses that are not eligible.
Right, right.
Great.
And so do check out those other materials on the, managing your loan, because there's a lot more in there about that describe different examples of those items as well.
Right, and I want to, not only is there FMA's site, which as you saw in Gina's early slides is extensive, just to reiterate, the first couple of webinars that we did with Gina are on our YouTube channel. So go to YouTube, Nonprofit Quarterly, and you'll see more of that early work about what's eligible, et cetera.
Yep. So now we're here, the moment we've all been waiting for. We're in the, how do I calculate the penalty, potential penalty section. This is where we can talk about, what does it look like to calculate some penalty related to wage reduction? And what does it look like to calculate my FTE? So really there's two potential penalties. The first penalty, potential penalty related to salary reduction. What is this reduction trying to get at, right? Sometimes this framing is helpful. So we want to look at new employees who started working for our organization in calendar 2020. And we want to look at employees with an average annualized salary of $100,000 or less in 2019. So that's our population here, where we're looking at this test for wage reduction. So if someone in 2019 made $101,000, you're not going to look at them for this test. Okay. A lot of emotions come up. I had a lot of emotions looking at this, like, oh, does this make sense? This is not about what folks feel is correct or not from an HR perspective, things of that nature. We really have to just try and figure out, we're trying to see if these penalties apply to us when it comes to PPP loan forgiveness. And so I too had lots of questions like, well, does that make sense? And it's not about that. So we just have to kind of keep the framing of what we're trying to use this information for. So we're going to look at anybody who was new in 2020, regardless of compensation, and anyone who made 100 or less in 2019. We then are going to see if during our covered period, those folks took a pay cut or were paid less than 25% of what they were paid in the first quarter of 2020. Don't worry if this all seems like, what are we talking about here? Because we just threw out many dates and time periods. We've got a chart coming up. We're going to walk through a couple of examples, but we're going to figure out who do we need to look at reduction, and what are the time frames we're concerned about, right? So we're concerned about what did we pay them in our covered period? What did they make in the first calendar quarter of 2020? If what they made in the covered period was 26% less or more than 26% less, we're going to have a penalty. So you could, if you reduce someone's wage by 25%, there's no penalty that results, right? Or any reduction up through 25%. We then will also see, even if we did have a reduction in wage, there are some, do we qualify for a safe harbor for restoring their salary, right? If we restored their salary, we also could avoid a penalty. So let's look and see what it looks like. And we're going to spend some time here. This is where, again, there's lots of information on this slide, but we tried to give you a couple of different examples of what might have happened with someone's salary. So let's look at a couple of folks here. Let's take a look at Anthony, who's the fourth individual down. So you might be wondering, well, why are we calculating some kind of reduction or some kind of a penalty here? If you look all the way to the right, there's a $2,300 penalty, which that's a direct dollar for dollar reduction in forgiveness for PPP. Why is this on this line? Because this person made over $100,000. I thought I didn't have to worry about these folks for this penalty. Anthony is listed here, and there's a reduction because Anthony started working for us in 2020. So remember, the population is everybody. We've got to look at everybody who started in 2020 and folks who made 100,000 and less in 2019. So by virtue of the fact this person didn't work in 2019, they're in our evaluation. Okay? And then the way it worked is we take in that first quarter. So now here's where this first quarter comes in. Their average annualized salary in the first quarter is $120,000. We could reduce by 25% and not have a penalty. So a 25% reduction would mean that Anthony was making during the covered period an annualized salary of $90,000. But we see that this individual was reduced further. During the covered period, they were paid based on an annualized salary of $75,000. So that's a $15,000 annual reduction. That means over this 8-week covered period, they really lost out on $2,307.67. That's that $15,000 reduction below the 25%. That's what that shakes out in someone's gross pay for 8 weeks. That's how this wage reduction penalty works. Okay? So it's what the person would have made if their reduction was only limited to 25%. It's a differential between what they made, you bring them up to, only a 25% reduction. What did they lose out on? I see Jean nodding, so I hope that that is a good thing, and we've kind of described that appropriately. We see a couple of other folks with no reduction. Robin, of course, did not have a 25% wage reduction. Jill had a wage reduction, but Jill's been with us since 2016. She's not in the evaluation because last year in 2019, she made over 100,000. So we don't have to evaluate Jill. Zara did not have more than, or Zara had a pay cut, but it was restored. Right, so Zara took a pay cut from $25 an hour to $15 an hour, which was more than 25%, but her pay was restored. And it was restored by 12/31/20. So no penalty because it was restored. And then we have Anthony with the reduction. Sally has a similar reduction. It works the same way, but we've given an example where it's an hourly rate instead of a salary, just so we can work through those.
Yeah, we do have a number of questions about if we treat people differently, not because of the 100,000, but just because salary versus hourly. Is it? No, it's just about wage, total compensation.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
So no, people asked about that.
Yep.
Good.
Mm-hmm.
Workers' comp has come up a number of times because you haven't said those words. Is that covered?
No, workers' comp is not considered an eligible expense.
Great. Thank you.
Yep. So we need to know, right, what we've paid folks. And if we have a small number of employees, it could be easy. If we have lots of folks who took pay cuts, we've got to do this one by one for each individual. And we calculate the penalty here follows the individual, right? So this is one that it's person by person. It's individualized to this employee. So that's the first of the two potential penalties. The second potential penalty, this is our FTE count, right? So where the wage reduction was by person, because this is my salary, the FTE count is not specific. When we start counting folks, we're counting full-time equivalent employees. We're not matching up person to person. So we'll explain what that means, right? But what is this reduction trying to get at? This reduction is trying to compare what our FTE count was in our covered period, right? So just like we looked at wages during our covered period, what was our FTE count in our covered period as compared to one of two possible comparison periods. So this, remember, this is one of the choices we have to make. What's going to be our FTE comparison period? So we're going to choose either 2/15/19 to 6/30/19 as our FTE comparison period, right? How many FTEs did I have during that period as compared to my covered period? Or a more recent covered period, 1/1/20 to 2/29/20. Right? These are going to be, we're going to choose one of these as our comparison period. That's one of the choices. Know that if you're considered a seasonal employer, you can choose an alternative covered period. And again, the other materials have additional guidance as to, what does that alternative covered period look, or alternative comparison period look like for a seasonal employer. So we're going to choose a period. Now, it's no mystery that we're going to choose the comparison period where we had the lower FTE count, right? Because this is a lower bar we are trying to hit in terms of maintaining FTEs and avoiding penalty. So really, this is the name of the game. And which of these periods did I have a lower count if there's any variation? And then we're going to calculate FTEs. So how are we going to count these folks, right? How do we do the calculation? Well, we've got a couple of options here for how we figure out what our FTE count was. We can either do a mathematical method, which is straight math, just as what it sounds like, where in this simple example we're looking at, if we're just taking 1 week, and I have an employee who works 16 hours a week, I take 16 hours, I divide it by a 40-hour work week, and we have to use a 40-hour work week. That is defined by the SBA. So it's not your work week. It's not 35, 37 and a half, it's 40. Don't worry, if you choose the mathematical method and your standard work week is 35, you're always comparing apples to apples. So if somebody was a 0.8 in your covered period because they work a full-time 35-hour week, and I don't know if that math is correct, I just made up that 35 divided by 40 would be 0.8, then they're going to be 0.8, in your comparison period as compared to your cover. It's going to be the same. You're comparing apples to, so don't worry if your work week is not 40. Just be consistent in your methodology of calculation. So in this case, 16 divided by 40 is 0.4. This person is a 0.4 FTE. So this is how we're going to start to figure out what's our FTE count. The way you do this for your covered period is the same. I take all of my hours on my covered period. So what someone worked over the 8 weeks, I divide by 8 for the 8 weeks, and then I divide by 40. So it is just that simple math. We also have another option. We also have option for a simple method, which gets us out of doing math. And the simple method might be a good alternative for folks who have lots of variable hour employees, lots of part-timers. It makes everyone either be 1 FTE if they work at least 40 hours, or they're a 0.5 FTE if they work less than 40. It gets you out of doing math. Again, you need to be consistent in what method you choose and use it all the time. It will not harm you because you're always comparing the apples to apples when you do this, okay? Now, I do want to get to the exceptions that lots of folks are wondering about, because this all sounds great, but what if I had people leave for various reasons? How will this affect my FTE count? Because really now the name of the game is maintaining, not having reduction in FTE count. So we have some exemptions. If you had somebody, say, who was laid off, and you made a good faith written offer to rehire that person during this period, and this offer was rejected, right? It's our first little box there. Or if you had an employee who was fired for cause during your covered period. Or if the employee themselves voluntarily resigned or requested to receive a reduction in their hours during the covered period. Or if you made a good faith effort to rehire for a certain kind of position and you could not find a similarly qualified employee by 12/31/20, right? Maybe it was something really particular, certain qualifications, things of that nature. Then you can treat those employees as if they were there the whole time during your covered period. You do not get penalized. So you treat them as if they worked the same number of average hours during the weeks they weren't there, right? Either because they were fired for cause or what have you, as they worked during the weeks they were there. It does not harm your calculation. And so similarly, we have examples of this. So Alice was at 30 hours when she was working for our organization. She worked about 30 hours a week on average. During the second week of our covered period, Alice was fired for cause. We still continue to treat Alice as if she was there for 30 hours a week for the whole covered period. She ends up being a 0.8 FTE, which is just 30 divided by 40. Or under the simple method, she's 0.5 because she works less than 40 hours. So this is what we're talking about. It does not harm your calculation, okay? Diane requested a reduction in hours, right, voluntarily. So similarly, is not harming our calculation. And then we have other folks that we did not have to enact any exemptions. Jackson was a 40-hour employee and continued that way through the covered period. And Rami was a 28-hour employee and stayed working that way. So this is how we could take advantage of those exemptions. But really what we're trying to do now, we just want to walk through a full mathematical method for you and bring all of this together. So we're going to have to compare this FTE headcount in our covered period to an FTE count in our comparison period. So as a reminder, the way this works is pick a comparison period, right? So we're either going to pick that 2/15/19 to 6/30/19 period, or we're going to pick 1/1/20 to 2/29/20. This is where all of this data that we gathered in the beginning is going to come in, because we might, if it's not clear to us, if we're not sure what our FTEs were in each of these periods, we're going to have to count the average FTEs for both periods and see which one is lower. And then that I will choose as my covered period. As my comparison period. Then, of course, I'm going to calculate my FTEs, right, in both my comparison period, which here for this organization, they chose the 2/15/19 to 6/30 comparison period. We see they had more folks during that time frame. They had average 4 full-time FTEs during that period. On the slide we just looked at, right, where we saw Diane, we saw Rami, we saw Jackson, right? We saw all our employees. That was during our covered period. We only had 3.3 average FTEs. So we only had 3.3. So clearly for this organization, they had a reduction, because now in my comparison period, I have 4. So I went from 4 to 3.3. Now I have what I need to calc my penalty. So picking my comparison period where I had the lower FTEs, calculating my average FTEs during the comparison period, calculating during the covered period. This organization had 4 during the comparison period, 3.3 average FTEs during the covered period. I do simple division. I get this quotient of 0.825. That means that my maximum forgiveness is 82.5%. What it means is a 17.5% reduction in forgiveness. Likely an FTE reduction penalty will hurt you more than a wage reduction penalty, right? Because this is a proportion of everything. So
and
that's
just
why—
to be clear, just to be clear, the penalty, quote unquote, is that portion of the loan is not forgiven, and therefore you will pay it back on whatever interest rate it was issued at.
Correct. Yep. And so I want to kind of also skip ahead to show you what this might look like in a completed application. So we gathered in our first step here information as to how the dollars were spent. And this was my first part. What did I spend the money on? This organization spent their PPP loan on payroll to the tune of $36,385. They didn't spend any on business mortgage interest payments, but they spent some dollars on rent and utilities. This organization had a $4,000 wage reduction penalty. That brings us from we started at a maximum forgivable amount of $44,000 based on what we spent. After subtracting the wage reduction penalty, we're down to a maximum forgiveness of $40,000. Now here comes my FTE reduction penalty. So here's where I see my 0.825 popping in. I have to multiply it by this number up above, which is my now already been reduced by my wage reduction penalty amount. So this organization's maximum forgiveness is going to be $33,317. Their whole loan was $55,000. And we see not only did they not spend the whole loan, right, because they only spent $44,000, they then had a reduction in forgiveness because of the penalties. So for folks that are wondering as well, line 10 might strike folks as strange. What's this weird $60,000 number? This just serves to keep your ratios in check. Right? It serves to keep your ratios in check. It's letting you know that based on what you spent on payroll, right, your maximum forgiveness would have been X, right? It's limiting your forgiveness to 60%, but you can never exceed your loan amount. So do not worry about mental gymnastics around line 10. It's just serving to keep our ratios in check. Now, besides filling this out in this detailed way, of course, we mentioned we're going to have to also complete some certifications. So there's a certification page where we have to certify we used the funds for allowable purposes, that we appropriately calculated our penalties related to workforce or wage reductions, things of that nature, okay? So this is why it's a good idea for us to practice starting to put this together. It's not too soon to look and see, well, do any of these penalties apply to me? Because again, we have a long time horizon here. We have potentially, 10 months after our covered period ends to apply. So we don't need to rush to do this. We can take our time and move through the calculations.
We have about a minute, and I think I don't usually do this, but I think if you're open to it, I'd like to take about 2 or 3 questions, which may take 3 minutes, just to let people know. So one is just the safe harbor piece. Obviously, you have to go read that carefully, but we've had some people say, well, I'm in New York City, the whole place was COVID shut down. Is this even relevant? I mean, of course, our loan is forgiven. Is that, that was C of your A, B, and C in terms of loan forgiveness, but even if your entire business was rendered impossible by shelter in place, do you still need to meet A on the forgiveness piece?
Yep, so you still have to meet A,
right,
because the purpose of and so there still could be a penalty related to A, which is the wage reduction.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you recall, the purpose of PPP was to provide funds to keep workers paid.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
So essentially, because we don't have a lot of time. So if you're A and C, if this is from slide, the very early in the slide participants, where in order to even be for forgiveness, you had to have a combination of things. So if you had a very significant COVID-related safe harbor, like a theater, right? You just can't do anything of your business. You obviously are going to have the FTE reduction. Potentially.
So you could be, yeah.
So in other words, even if your C is just enormous, you definitely you cannot function what are your issues in A or B, I guess is the question. I mean, you still have to maintain employment, right? Or
yeah, you still have to use the dollars for the eligible expenses.
Right.
So we still have to pay attention to that. In that first slide where it was A, B, or C, that was really, can I use the EZ form?
Okay.
So you still have to go through, did I spend on eligible expenses?
Right.
Did I spend in the covered period? Calculate those carefully. That is what will be reviewed, right?
Okay.
And
so again, just to summarize, regardless of how disrupted your business is, if you took a PPP loan, it has to be used on the eligible pieces. You know,
and
if
you still have to apply for forgiveness.
Yeah, if you
still have to apply.
You're not going to be forgiven.
It's not check the safe harbor and you're good.
Right.
It's check the safe harbor. We know you could have had a reduction, but also you still have to provide the supporting documentation and follow all the other rules.
Right. And then lastly, the question is around burden of proof. So there's a lot of subjectivity in things like fired with cause, decided to quit, you know, that kind of language that is potentially exemptions from your reduction in FTE penalty. What do you expect will be the kinds of burdens of proof for those exemptions of FTE?
Yeah, and that's always a tricky question. So many of these items then start to touch upon things like HR law, labor laws, and things of that nature. So really if we have any question as to if called upon to provide that evidence, what would it have to look like? That's really check with labor attorney on that as to where you're operating. What does that look like in your state? Could be different from state to state. For sure, if we have to prove anything at any point in time, it's always written documentation in the least. So, you know, oral kind of evidence usually doesn't stand up. So what written documentation do I need?
Right. So sort of summarizing that, everything, you should assume that the scrutiny would be high if it's reviewed, and it would be following the labor law around that terminology. It's not
Correct.
Small business law, it's labor law around.
Yeah, it's not redefined by the SBA. Correct.
Got it.
Yep.
Excellent. Well, Gina, thank you as always so much. We've said it all throughout this session, but the FMA website is obviously has a wealth of resources. The NPQ YouTube channel has the previous webinars that had a lot to do with expense eligibility, etc. At NPQ, we always welcome your support and your readership, as this slide says. And Gina has been kind enough, as I said at the beginning, to offer with me to kind of review the Q&A report. So we are going to attach not only the recording and the slides, but also resources that seem germane to the most prominent questions. So thank you all for being with us. Thank you for the work you do. Thank you, Gina, again, for your partnership.